My interest in Tibetan studies goes back to my father, number one. Number two, we were interested in Sanskrit grammar since the 4 generations ago. And somehow my father came to know that some lost Sanskrit grammars have been preserved in Tibetan. And that was the starting point of our interest in Tibetan studies. My great-grandfather sat in the Indian Educational Service, and which was primarily a British-dominated service. But there was no distinction between the Indians and the British who entered the service. So he used to teach English grammar. The family priest told him that the Sanskrit grammar of Panini is far superior to the English grammar. He said yes. So he studied Sanskrit grammar, and suddenly he found that like Sanskrit, M for the accusative case and S for the genitive case. Then my grandfather came. He studied, again he was in the Indian Education Service, and a very privileged service for Indians at that time. He also used to teach English grammar. But his main interest was Vedic studies, and particularly the exegesis of the Rig Veda. And according to the tradition of Arya Samaj, Maharshi Dayanand, the founder of Arya Samaj, had said that you have to interpret the Vedic tradition on the basis of the grammar of Panini. So Panini became a very important aspect of the study of my grandfather. My father inherited this tradition of studying Panini's grammar. And while he was still a young boy, 10 years aged, he saw a beautiful book published on Sanskrit grammar from England. Gana Ratna Mahodadhi. It was so beautiful that my father decided that someday he will go to England to study how they print such beautiful books without a single error in that 400-page long text. So my father studied Sanskrit grammar. And then he had made up his mind to go to England to study grammar. When he went to England, he saw for the first time the books of Liebisch in German. In these books, Liebisch had written on Sanskrit texts which had been lost in India but were preserved in Tibetan translation. My father got interested in the restoration of these texts, Tibetan translations, back into Sanskrit. And I have a letter from F.W. Thomas of the University of Oxford, dated 6 July 1930, in which he discusses my father's restoration of the Sanskrit grammar from Tibetan. My father was so fascinated by Tibetan, which had preserved quite a large number of Sanskrit texts, and also commentaries on Sanskrit grammar. And that is the beginning of our interest in Tibetan studies. And he came back to India in 1931, and in 1934 he started the International Academy of Indian Culture, where many people used to come. There were scholars from the Netherlands, scholars from England, Rylands from the School of Oriental African Studies, and there were Japanese monks in the institute, in the academy. There was a Cambodian monk, so a number of people used to stay. And if you ask me the variation in my interest, all the people, guests who came to study with my father, they left fascinating memories of their presence. And they would bring beautiful paintings, beautiful palm leaf manuscripts. And I was so thrilled by everything they brought. It gave me a new vision how beautiful is this world. So This was a very interesting period in India's history. We were emerging out of a colonial attitude to life. The freedom struggle was I think, at its apex at that time in the 1930s. And at the same time, the Theosophy was a very important input. And in Theosophy, the Mahatmas of Tibet and the mystique of Tibet that had been created by Madame Blavatsky, who had founded the Theosophical Society in 1875 in New York, later on in India, at Bihar in Chennai. So this the whole idea of the Theosophical Society and their glorification of the Mahatmas of Tibet were also a major contribution to the understanding of Tibet's heritage by India. And unfortunately, at that time, there were no Indian scholars who would take up Tibetan. The University of Calcutta started, but only one scholar, Vidhu Shekhar Bhattacharya, took up the challenge. So, Theosophy was also very important because Annie Besant, one of the leaders in the Theosophical movement in India, was interested in Tibetan. And she spoke about India's freedom. She spoke about the great Mahatmas of Tibet. So our house was a place where many people from different countries came and spoke of many lands, not only China, about Tibet and so on, about Cambodia, about Indonesia. But Tibet somehow, was something very special. Then in 1936, my father had two Japanese students. He was very keen to get the Derge edition of the Kangyur and Tanjur. And there was an Indian official, political officer stationed at Yatung in Tibet. So he went in the month of December. My father and me, we went in a horse carriage, terribly cold. So we went to see this Indian official from Yatung. My father wanted to discuss with him how to get a set of the Derge Kangyur. For the first time I saw these great brocade dresses of Tibet. They fascinated me. I asked my father, who is this king? From which country does he come? Because we thought only kings and emperors wore brocades and so on. And anyway, I had never seen an Indian wearing a brocade. So we saw in the warmth of his room those charming brocades. And somehow I was stunned, to see how he, he such beautiful had caps. He was wearing the full Tibetan costume, and the big caps he was wearing. So my father discussed with him, and when we on the return, we again were in the horse carriage, extremely cold, shivering. Month was December. Lahore was very cold, something like 1 degree centigrade. So I asked my father, what is this? Who is he? And my father said he is an Indian, but he stays in Tibet. And in Tibet they wear these dresses because it is very cold. And they believe in the beauty of life. I said, one day I must go to Tibet to see how beautiful is the country, how beautiful is their language. So my father, after a few days, my father brought the grammar of Kuroshichuma Shandor. I tried to study that grammar, it was impossible. So I told my father, I will copy these Lancha letters. The Lancha letters were very beautiful to me. And so I made large copies of those Lancha letters, which were used for writing Sanskrit mantras. At that time we had the foolscap size paper, so the letters were 1 foot long. And I made all these letters. It took me about two months to make all these Lancha letters, but they came out beautiful. If India had not been partitioned, I wouldn't have lost them, and I might even have had them today. So that was my first. Then my father said, okay, doesn't matter. And then he, 1937, he wanted some Tibetan Lama. Gendun Choepel was sent to him by someone I think by George Lurie. Gendun Choepel came, and my father requested him to translate one of the grammatical texts from Tibetan into Hindi or English. He knew little Hindi, perhaps he knew better English. But Gendun Choepel somehow could not understand that grammar at all. And my father said, I will study Sanskrit grammars. So he used to go to Merchant Lakshman Das, Sanskrit booksellers in Lahore. But there he became interested in prostitutes. And Merchant, the bookseller, said, Professor, what have you done? You are sending a person to me, he brings prostitutes to my shop. So my father had to tell Choepel to go away. I think he stayed with us for 1 month and he had to go away because the bookshop where he used to go to buy books, perhaps he never brought any Sanskrit grammar or studied any Sanskrit grammar. So my father was very unhappy to see that there is no one to be found who could understand these ancient texts on Sanskrit grammar. Then in 1939, Vidhushekar Bhattacharya published the Bhota Prakash. Bhota Prakash was a very interesting book, so I studied Tibetan. The letters were beautiful. Well, I have learned the Tibetan alphabet from the dictionary of Yashke. In Karachi Choma, the Tibetan typography was horrible. But in the dictionary of Yashke, at the beginning of every letter, they were beautiful letters. I copied out all of them. To me, they seemed to be daggers, carved with long, sharp edges ending the letter. So, I asked my father, why are these letters, all like knives? He said, perhaps Pummi Sambhota was a soldier. So I let the book thing ended there. But the ending of the Tibetan letter, I think is one of the most beautiful of the scripts in the Indic family of scripts. So then the Bhota Prakasha came, so for 2 years, 39 and 1940, I studied the Bhota Prakasha. That was my beginning of Tibetan studies. I read the whole book in 2 years. I could recite many of them. And then in 1941, I joined the college, Forman Christian College, an American college run by American missionaries. Beautiful college with great teachers. We had British teachers, we had American teachers, of course, many Indian teachers. So when I went there, one day I used to, during the intermission between one period and we had one class and the other, I would go and sit down in the library to read the Faust of Goethe. My father had the German text, but then in the college there was an English text. So for the first time I read the whole of Faust in 1 year, comparing the German and the English. One day I was standing near in the museum in the college, and there was a money stone. The American professor who was vice principal of the college, Professor Ross Wilson, he came along. He said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "Sir, looking at the money stone. Do you understand this?" I said, "Yes, I understand it. I have studied Tibetan for 2 long years." So he said, "Can you send me a note?" I said, "No, I will write a full-scale article." So I wrote a long article on the money stone. That was my first article in the English language or any other language on any subject. But my first article of my life in 1941. Professor Ross Wilson saw my article. It was 40 pages long and began with a very interesting work of 1857 by Keppen, Lamaische Hierarchie und Kirche, Lamaistic Hierarchy and Church. And I think, I still feel that it has the most beautiful description of Om Mani Padme Hum. I translated it from German into English. So Professor Ross Wilson shortened my article, put it in the college magazine. I never wrote for the college magazine. And at the end of the year, we used to get distinction for whatever examination we did in the examination. That year I had the highest distinction, distinction in all the 5 subjects, distinction in the Hindi section of the magazine, distinction in the English section of the magazine. In the English section, and the time to hand over the certificate of distinction for the English section came, Professor Ross Wilson himself stood up and said that I have shortened his article. It's a brilliant article. And now I give him the 8th distinction, that he will teach history in the Punjab University. Of course, partition came, so there was no question. And I acquired a more or less iconic presence in the college. So Tibetan gave to me an iconic presence in that college. And I always felt that Tibetan has something to do with me. So I spent till 1947, till the partition of India, I was studying in the college. But in April 1946, my father got another Tibetan Lama, Sangpo. He was a Buddhist Lama, sent by the KGB to India to do surveillance in Tibet. And Sangpo was supposed to be a great scholar and was supposed to know Sanskrit. He didn't know Sanskrit as such, but could write Sanskrit mantras beautifully in the Lancha script. Was a painter. So my father again requested him to translate the Tibetan Sanskrit text from Sanskrit grammar into English or Hindi, whichever he liked. Or he could use both and translate them in a mixed jumble of both 2 languages. Sangpo spent about 6 months. I used to study Tibetan with him. I studied the Situi Sumtag, Situ's work, explanation of the basic writings of Thommi Sambhota. It was again an experience to see how close Situ was to the Indian tradition, because his commentaries would not be read unless you had read the Sanskrit text of Siddhanta Kaumudi. Most of the grammatical terms were translations of Sanskrit. So the Tibetan terms had to be reconstituted into Sanskrit for me to understand. So I read Situi Sanbhag, very difficult text. And actually, it should have been Sanskrit translated into Sanskrit. It would have been more, it should have been clearer and also clearer, and at the same time you could correlate the ideas of Situ, because Situ is one of the greatest Bodhisattvas of Tibet. I think his knowledge of Sanskrit was perfect, because his translation of the Amarakosha, his Situi Suntvar, could not have been done without a very clear understanding of the Siddhanta Kaumudi. My own feeling is that he must have read the Siddhanta Kaumudi in Nepal. So that Sangpo went away after 5 or 6 months. Then Professor Nobel came to us. Partition had taken place. We have shifted from Lahore to Nagpur. Professor Nobel came. Professor Nobel used to work on the Sanskrit chaya. My father called it chaya, not reconstruction, of the Vinaya Vastu. So Professor Nobel came about 3 times for the reconstruction of the Vinaya Vastu, Tibetan Vinaya Vastu into Sanskrit. Certain portions were available in the Gilgit manuscripts, and the others had to be reconstructed. So then came Professor Hum, Friedrich Richard Hum. He also worked on Tibetan. So a number of scholars worked on Tibetan. Then in 1954, our relations with China perhaps had found certain problems arose with China. So the Department of Intelligence of the Indian, what is it called? The Department of Intelligence of the Home Ministry of the Government of India, they sent 2 people to be trained in Tibetan studies. I wrote a grammar of spoken Tibetan, not classical Tibetan, in which I gave not only the spoken form but also what the Chinese have done, because they have introduced a large number of Chinese technical terms into Tibetan. And because the 2 young students who were helping us to do intelligence work of the Indian frontiers, they had to know these Chinese technical terms. So I did this special grammar in Hindi called Board Shiksha. In 1957, I wrote an article on sumbums. In Europe, there was always a problem of the many multi-volume sumbums. And nobody knew the term sumbum. So when I wrote this article, there was a great, I received a large number, I think 10 or 15 letters on this whole idea, wherein I have said that the sumbums have not to be separated into texts. They have to be kept as collected works, opera omnia in the Christian church, of an author. And they have to be catalogued as they are printed. So when Dean Smith came to see me in 1957, he said, the first thing I heard about you was the sumbum. And a great problem, because in many places they were trying, but particularly in library, they had separated the sumbums and put different texts apart. So now they have to be reconstituted back into the volumes. So Dean Smith said, you were the first one to introduce the word sumbum to Western Tibetan academics. In 1958, I had to go to Tibet. The Chinese had invited an Indian delegation to work in the Tibetan monasteries on Sanskrit manuscripts. Somehow the idea fell through. 1962. I created, for the first time, Tibetan printing press. In India, we had only 2 presses, 2 in Calcutta, which could print Tibetan. And they said it will take, I had finished my Tibetan-Sanskrit Dictionary, and I wanted to print it. So the first volume was written by my wife by hand, Dr. Chandra. But the later volumes were to be printed. So Ka was also written by her by hand, the volume with Ka. So I created Tibetan printing twice. It took me about 8 months to create Tibetan printing types. It was not just the Tibetan, but also the conjunct consonants like bha, dha, used for transcription of Sanskrit dharanis. So it was a very complete fount of Tibetan pipes. 1979, went to Oxford for the Tibetan conference. There I met Edward Conze for the first time. He was, quite an interesting person, also full of anguish. He said, what pontification Radha Krishnan has done to the West, now I am giving in return in my life. I haven't read his life so far. I would love to read it. I spoke there on Buddhism. People were, nobody agreed with me on the identification of Buddhism. So they said, this thing, that thing. I said, no, the question is how the word is written in the Tibetan script. Unfortunately, Badal had confused Uddiyana, which is Swat, now in Pakistan, and Uddiyana. Uddiyana in Tamil means country, the wasteland. So it is actually Kanchipuram. So I said it is Kanchipuram and the Kanchi state. And Indra Bhuti was not in the northwest, but he was in the south. I still hold that opinion. So the people didn't agree, so when I said, well, I have thrown a tiny pebble into a placid pond. Gather the ripples if you can. Oh, there was a shore. Very impolite. 5 or 6 people stood up. I said, okay, doesn't matter. If you don't accept what Baham, that's my opinion, you can have your opinion. But the question is, from where did Padma Bhushan come? In the work of Professor Tucci, in his Tibetan Painted Scroll, Indra Bhuti went in a boat to collect Chintamani. Actually, Chintamani is the name of a very special horse, what you may call an Arab steed, high horse. Whenever the Indians went on a boat, they took a horse along with them. And this we see in many thankas. For example, in the series of thankas in an American museum of the Jatak Mada, in the Shurparak Jataka. Shurparak is coming back with the boat and other objects, but a horse is coming out for the first. So the horse, Chintamani is a horse, Chintamani is not jewel. So the whole life of Padma Bhushan, as presented in the Tibetan tradition, has to be re-understood. Now, from where did he come? Ngayab, Lanka. So, Ngayab is Chamara Dvipa near Lanka. What I said was that he must have found a small boy roaming on the Chamara island and brought him back, trained him. He was a Sri Lankan. And I also added this note that the sailors, Roman sailors, Arab sailors, used to come from long distances like Alexandria, and when they landed, they found a woman, they put life into her. So Padma Bhushan must be the son of some Roman or some Arab trader. That is why he has no parents. He doesn't know his parents. Anyhow, and then the Padma Bhushan, when Indra Bhuti brought him, trained him as a prince, he left the palace, came out, because he was not accustomed to family life, not accustomed to room life, wandering around. So he wandered away to Sri Parvata. And Sri Parvata ultimately became the Shambhala of paradise. With all my explanation, well, I couldn't convince anyone that Odiyana is Kanchipuram. So my experience at Oxford was something quite, I think I was the only one who raised the dust. Others were just, they were speaking. There was no discussion, nothing. But in my case, it was a very violent discussion. In 1988, I suggested the giving of a Nobel Prize to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I knew the person who was in charge of the Norwegian Nobel Committee for Peace Prize, and ultimately His Holiness got August 89. You have asked about my growing up in British India. My father has studied in London, so many of the officials in Lahore were his friends who had studied with him in London. But my father used to speak every day at the temple on the Bhagavad Gita, where he spoke also on revolution. And many times he had to go to the prison. Every day he would go to the district magistrate, sit there the whole day, and with the rising of the court he would come back home. Many of them were his friends, so they didn't put him in the lock and key. He used to speak on Gandharan art twice a year. once in the winter and once in autumn, no, once in summer. So I used to go with him to the Lahore Museum, which had a fantastic collection of Gandharan statues. I would ask him, Father, would you talk about these images? So he would just say, they do not talk to you. I said, no, they cannot talk, they are images. My father would just keep, he said, one day you will understand. So, and most of the majority of the audience were British officials who came to hear him speak on the Gandharan statues. Sometimes he would find in the audience person in whose court he had sat for the whole day, hungry, thirsty, because he never drank or ate anything cooked by a Muslim. And most of the soldiers in Lahore were Muslims. And he would always tell them that we had had such a long millennium of Muslim rule. We never had any revolution. But when the British came, all this freedom struggle is what we have learned, not in India, but in London. The British officials, were stunned by his statement. He said, all that we do here, we learned in England. So now, one day, Nicholas Rerich had a beautiful exhibition of Himalayan painting, fantastic exhibition, about 100 paintings. And in the audience, I think only 5 or 6 Indians, most of them were European, mostly British. My father said to Nicholas Rerich that he would recite the Mangalacharana, the auspicious stanza, Astyut Parasyam Dishiti Vatatma. Himalayo Nama Nagadiraja, Purva Parum, Puya Nijiva Gaya, Tita Prithivya Iva Manavendra. The British officials were stunned, what is he doing? Then Nicholas Rerich spoke about his exhibition. That was the first exhibition in India of paintings on the Himalayas. No Indian artists have painted the Himalayas that far. And Himalayas have been the mountain of the sages in the Indian tradition. They are the mountains, where the Tibet is situated. So, my interest in Buddhism begins, with my father's speeches on the Gandharan statues. I went many times with him, I think, but must have been there 10 or 15 times. He would go every year, twice I would go with him. And particularly the images with meditation. I think they captivated me the most. I understood nothing. I understood nothing of what my father spoke because he used to speak in English. I hadn't learned English by that time. So I must just sit down, listen, think of the images. What they conveyed to me, what they spoke to me, I think is found in my dictionary of Buddhist iconography. The iconography fascinated me. I gave up Vedic studies, gave up historical studies for the sake of iconography, because that was my fascination. The beauty of form, how the divine can assume form. What we say avatara, we have avatars of Vishnu. So they are avatars of the multiple facets of the divine. You asked about my interest in languages in the plural. In my home, there were people who spoke different languages. My first language was not Hindi, my mother tongue. It was English. On the 1st of January 1935, I started the study of English. My teacher was an Irish lady who had become a Hindu. So she would come every day and she didn't speak a single word of Hindi with me. Sometimes I didn't understand, so I had to ask my father or my mother what the word meant. So my first language and my first script was not my own, it was foreign. I could speak English after about 7 or 8 months. Finished about 3 readers up to the 3rd standard in 8 months. Thereafter my father put me in a school. It's in a British school. The British school, we could not speak Hindi. If we spoke Hindi, we had to stand in the class with our face to the wall. I used to always stood first in English. No spelling mistake, no grammatical mistake in my writing. So one day I asked Miss MacDonald, the British principal, "Ma'am, I stand first in English, and every time you put me in the whole 1 hour in the classroom standing facing the wall, it's an insult to the English language." She was, taken aback. Never put me in front of the wall after that. She knew that I represented the beauty, the dignity of the English language. Because I never made any spelling mistake, no grammatical mistake. I had a good memory, so I could really repeat most of what was written in the readers. So there was no question of forming sentences. The sentences came to me naturally, rather simplified, more simple than the textbook languages. I studied Hindi with my mother. My mother used to relate the Mahabharata to me. I have heard the Mahabharata in Hindi for 1 year. There were about, 10 or 15 volumes. So it was more or less a Hindi version of the Mahabharata of Vyasa. In the northern version, not in the critical edition. Critical edition is shorter. There were about 80,000 verses. So I heard the Mahabharata and I learned Hindi with the Mahabharata. My mother used to read to me after 1 or 2 months I started to read the Mahabharata myself. I was 1935. I was about 7 years old. Languages. In our house, there were Dutch scholars who were studying with me. They spoke Dutch. I heard Dutch, knew many words of Dutch. And there was a couple, they used to play the piano every morning and every evening. I would sit down and hear European music. Something superb. And even when I was a student in the Netherlands, I would go to the church to hear European music. Somehow European music enchanted me. Then in 1936, my father had Japanese students. So I started learning Japanese. And Japanese thrilled me. The first book that I read in Japanese, Shogaku Kokugo Tokuwan, it had beautiful cherry blossoms. The English primer began with cat and dog. So I asked my father, English books begin with a cat and dog. Why does the Japanese book begin with such beautiful cherry blossom? Must be a beautiful country. My father said it represents impermanence, anityata, cherry blossom. What is anityata? I didn't know. My father said, you will understand someday what is anityata. So I had to understand what is anityata. So I studied Japanese with the Japanese students. Then my father was, very much interested in Avesta. After 2 years, I studied Avesta. As a young boy, 10 years old. James Mill's grammar of Avesta. Avesta is a beautiful language, very close to Sanskrit. Of course, in the meantime, I had also begun studying Sanskrit. So languages, in our place, we had a Cambodian monk, Dhammavara. The Cambodian monk used to narrate stories, sometimes in English, sometimes in Hindi, awful Hindi. So I would listen to him. And sometimes he would recite Cambodian poetry, beautiful poetry, the way he sang. There was a Chinese student of my father who was studying Hindi. He was a classmate of Forman in the school. So for the first time I heard the name of Mao Zedong at the age of 10 or 11. And he would recite Chinese poetry weeping. In China, when they recite poetry, the tears must come down the eyes. So, heard Chinese poetry. I was studying Japanese, so in Japanese I had to study the Chinese character. The Chinese characters fascinated me, the brush strokes. And these brush strokes also made me, very cognizant of the Tibetan strokes of the alphabet. How Thombi Sambhota had created the long vertical lines in a very special way, and which is not to be found in any script of the Indic family. So the brush art of gsung. In our people who came, the Japanese brought a very beautiful painting of Amitabha. Huge sun, I think 1.5 feet, about half a meter big, round,
semicircular.
It was 1.5 meters, in not circumference but in
Diameter.
Beautiful and glowing all the time. So, I asked, what is this? The Japanese were telling me all sorts of things. And, sometimes they would recite. Their recitation fascinated me. They would recite Sanskrit. They came from the Shingon sect of Mantrayana. So they would recite Sanskrit. Their recitation was so different from ours. So all these impressions created in me a feeling of diversity, of immensity of the Indic systems. The art of, the first Japanese or Chinese, East Asian scroll I saw. We lost it in the partition. So the art, and the Japanese brought many beautiful books with pictures, Hiroshige's paintings and so on. Actually, my interest in art came from primarily from Japanese art, specifically the art of the Amitabha school.
Pure
Gendun Choepel brought, many small pictures of Tibetan icons. Many, I think about 30 or 40 small icons, about, let us say, about half A4 half. My father had them, and in the meantime, the brother-in-law of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was translating the Rajatarangini into English. He wanted the frontispiece to this to be the image of Nagarjuna. And at that time, Tibetan studies were to be found in India only in Calcutta, so they wrote to Calcutta. Nobody had a photograph of the Nagarjuna. My father had two, of course not very nice one, but he had two. So he sent them to Pandit Nehru, and they were, it was in the newspapers and this and that, and the newsmen came to interview my father. And what is this special Tibetan painting? So it was, this painting was had to be recreated by a Bengali artist. because the originals were in a very bad condition. So for me, all this, big big noise about the Tibetan Nagarjuna. I asked my father, what is this? He said, no, what you see here every day is Japanese. Tibetan art is different. So Tibetan art, I came to Tibetan art through Nagarjuna. You asked me if I had Buddhist teachers or Tibetan lamas. I had no Tibetan lama to teach me. My teacher was the Bhot Shiksha, Bhot Prakash, which I studied for 2 years just on my own. Sometimes my father would help me, because my father was busy with too many things, with his students at the institute which he had founded. There were no Buddhist teachers around except one Cambodian teacher and my father, Fuji Guruji from Japan. My father was with him to Afghanistan many times. Fuji Guruji had come to the ashram of Mahatma Gandhi and he wanted to see the stupas of Ashoka in Gandhara. So Mahatma Gandhi requested my father to go with him to Gandhara, because there was no one in India who would be interested in the Gandharan statues. My father was interested in Gandharan art. So Gandhiji requested him, he went with him. He used to go with Fuji Guruji, I think 4 or 5 times he went to Afghanistan. No place to stay there, so we would stay in the French archaeological mission compound. And take around, and they would also send people along with my father and Fuji Guruji and 2 of his students to the different sites in Afghanistan to see the stupas. So, Buddhist teachers. Buddhism, when we study Tibetan Buddhism is natural. So I studied Buddhism through some book. I have no memory of what book it was. It was a very small book published in England, but I have no idea what the title of the book was. We learned to speak Sanskrit, was our family tradition, particularly Sanskrit grammar. We used to memorize the whole of Panini. So the Panini is about 150 pages, and we had to memorize all these small formulae. Unless we knew the formulae, we couldn't make a new form, couldn't decline or conjugate. So Panini had to be learned by heart. Likewise, we had to learn logic. I memorized the whole of Tarka Sangraha, memorized the whole of Kavya Deepika, on literary stylistics. So in Sanskrit, we had to do a lot of learning, not only speaking, memorizing. Studies in the Netherlands. I was very much interested in Indonesia. When my father was a young student in the Netherlands under Professor Willem, Kalan said, I will introduce you to your countrymen. Professor Kalan introduced him to Priyo Hutomo. He was an Indonesian working on Navaruchi. Navaruchi is a classical text where Bhima goes to the underworld to find the ultimate Amrita. So we became very good friends, and later on Priyo Hutomo headed the school for police training in Jakarta when Indonesia became free, independent. So he came to see my father once again. So my father inherited this interest of Indonesian from Priyo Hutomo. And Priyo Tomo used to sing the old Japanese poems in his different styles. Different meters had to be sung in different styles. This was very unique for my father because he thought that all the different meters do not have special way of recitation. But Indonesia, at least in the time of Priyotomo, they knew the tradition for several meters. Then in 1931 and 32, my father was editing the Virat Parva of the Mahabharata. We went to Pune. Near Pune there was a hill station. So in the summer we were staying there for 3 months. And my father used to do 2 things. Early in the morning, 4 o'clock, he would sit up and start reading Danish. Because the Wolf had written a book in Danish on the Indonesian Mahabharata. So he first had to read Danish to read that book. So every morning he was reciting Danish. I asked my father, we want to sleep, what is the Danish? So he would just smile and go on with his Danish lesson. And ultimately, when he did the Mahabharata, Virat Parvan, that was the only Parvan which had been compared with this old Japanese version. He translated a number of passages. So I wanted to study old Japanese, so went to the Netherlands. I was there in 1950. Professor Fonda was known. I used to go to his house every morning. It was 8 o'clock till half dark. Very extremely cold. Half an hour's walk to his home from the place where I was staying. His wife was very kind to me, more or less like a mother. The first thing she would do was to bring extremely hot coffee, that first being coffee. So I would drink coffee and then we would start the lesson. I have put all those lessons now, they will come in my next book. I have put them in a proper format. Professor Konda would all the time tell me the grammar. Austronesian linguistics. Why? Because the spellings in Indonesian were a problem. The separation of words was also a problem. So for example, mangi, night, we can write W-N-I with a diacritics, or you can write W-E-N-I. In the Austronesian languages, they are dissyllabic based words. So every word has to be dissyllabic, without its the base word. With these formations, of course, it can be longer. So he would explain to me every word. I noted down every word, compared it. He will explain to me how the Indonesian differs from the Sanskrit text. Why does it differ? Why? What did the Indonesians understand while doing this Mahabharata? Mahabharata was done by a king under his personal care. While he was busy on the war front, his queen was busy supervising the translation of the Mahabharata. It was a remarkable experience to study with Professor Kunda. And of course, at the same time, we would also discuss the work of Professor Kaland. Professor Kaland has left a large number of texts which actually should be reproduced. For example, the Samaveda he has edited in its singing version. What we have today in India in the Samaveda is the Rik version, the word version, not the singing version. The singing version has a lot of syllables added for singing. We call them the Pushpa Sutra. So the text is the Pushpa Sutra that has not been edited so far, even after, let us say, 100 years, awaits publication. So, many things about Professor Kunda. And at the same time, Professor Honda, used to tell me interesting Sanskrit words. For example, he said Indonesians make beautiful words, propaganda. They have they converted it into Sanskrit, Purva Gandha. So he gave me a lot of these examples which come in my next book. I don't remember them at the moment. So, but Purva Gandha, and they were making secretary also. They made something into Rahas. I will forget. They made Sanskrit is the European word which became Bahasa Indonesia. But they have to be Sanskritized. They have to have a classical body, if not a classical linguistic base. But when I had done my promotion, got my degree, I requested Professor Kunda, what would you like to have as Guru Dakshina? He said, no Guru Dakshina. I said, I want them Shishya Dakshina. If you don't accept a present from me, I want a present from my Guru. He said, what? I said, I would like you to write Sanskrit in Indonesia. He said, accept it. He took 1 year and wrote Sanskrit in Indonesia. It's his masterpiece. In terms of linguistic theory, in terms of borrowing in languages, in terms of reaction, social background of those reactions. How you see a new language, how you see a developing language, and so on. So it became, very famous in Philippines because he devoted a chapter to the Sanskrit words in the Philippine language. Because originally Philippines was very close to Indonesia in linguistics. They spoke a language alike to Indonesian. So in the Netherlands, Professor Honda used to send his students to learn Hindi. I used to teach them Hindi. Every time they brought a lot of money for me, gave me my fees. I would go to the bookshop and buy books, but when I came back home, I had 1 truck full of books only. I requested Professor Kunda, made another request as Shishya Dakshina. Give to the student. Then he had completed his education. So I suggest that I would like to have all the publications of the Koninklijk Institute, the Royal Institute for the Netherlands, for Indonesia, covering 200 years, actually 160 years. He agreed, and I got also those books. So all those books and my books, they constituted 1 big truck of books, a whole library of Indonesian studies. And I think that was the only Indonesian collection, book on classical Indonesia in India. And the work I did, and much of it will be published in the next 4 or 5 volumes of mine on Indonesia. It was on the basis of the work, the material I had collected there. In the Netherlands, I had a colleague, Lokesh Dalai. She worked on the Indo-Scythian period of the Kushan. Kushan was fascinating for many reasons. And she gave me a book, I gave her a book. She was a co-student with me, but suddenly she got her degree and she became one of my teachers. So she said, how do I treat you, as a friend or as a student? I said, any way you like, we can discuss it. So we used to discuss the Kushan, many things. The Kushans have been discussed by by a French scholar, the name evades me at the moment. He says the Kushans were Bhagaputras. They used to supply horses to China. And the Chinese called them barbarians. He said, no, we are not barbarians, we are Bhagaputras, sons of God. Bhaga is Bhagavan, Lord, Putra is son, sons of the divine. So they were Bhagaputras. Now, Paul Pelio has said that the Bhagaputras became Kushans in India. They gave up the job of supplying horses to China, came to India, founded a vast empire. And they, the Bhagaputras, when Islam came to Central Asia, Bhagaputras became Gaputras. Gapur. Bha was omitted. The Arabs thought Ba is the prefix. The main word is Gapur. If they were Muslims, they became Gafurs. If they were Hindus or Buddhists, Shaivas or Buddhists, they became Kapurs. So it was a very interesting phenomenon how the Kushans have lived in India up to this day under the family name Kapur. So we would discuss with Lokesh and many of these things. So it was a pleasure to discuss because she read many things which I didn't. I had never read Paul Pelio's study of this word Kapur, but she had read, she made this observation. So there was Professor Van Boyton, who later on translated the Mahabharata. He was also my co-student, and we used to read many chapters of the Mahabharata where he found that the text is not very clear. I said the Indian method of reading the Mahabharata or a text, verse text is, we make a prose order first. We call it the Anvaya. Because in Sanskrit, every noun and every verb is declined or conjugated. So you can make a prose order of the verse. So I explained to him for the first time, when the Chandra is not clear, how we make an Anvaya of the verse and the text becomes clear. He said, yes. He was delighted. And also, said that for the first time, we understand how Indian mind differs from the Western mind. I said, it's not a question of difference. Question of literary evolution, which is far longer in India than anywhere else in the world. Because according to Bintonists, I agree with Bintonists in dating the Rig Veda on linguistic grounds to the 5th century or 6th century, 5th or 6th millennium BC, 5,000, 6,000 BC. So we are the longest tradition. So our way of interpreting. So Van Boyton, later on he went to the United States, and once he met, we were going to Australia for the International Orientalist Conference, and he said, I use your Anvaya method wherever I have a problem. I said, my Anvaya, at least with you, is great. He said, then he told me, why don't you change this Air India? Why do you write it in Devanagari? Such beautiful Sanskrit words. Find a beautiful Sanskrit word for your Air India. I said, now let us try Air India. They won't change. We have a Prime Minister who won't change. We have a Prime Minister? I said, yes, Prime Minister. So, a very interesting discussion with my friend, Dutch colleagues. Differences between Indian and European academia. I would like to go back to the Vesuvius, explosion in the Vesuvius. My father used to explain to me what is the difference between India and the West. He said the Vesuvius exploded and many of the things were found as they existed there. They just become molted in the lava of Vesuvius. He said, for example, they found tables and chairs, utensils for keeping eggs, and such things. So in the West, they have developed a very highly specialized way of living, very systematized way of living. For us, learning was more systematized. Living didn't matter. You could lie down on the floor, you could lie down on a mat, you could lie down on a cushioned bed, anywhere. So the whole idea of system, creating a system for everything, how the sequence in which you will serve food. For us it was new. How you would set the table. And these set tables were found in the explosion of the Vesuvius. On which side would be the knife, on which side the fork, and so on. So, it was a major difference. And this difference also made in the academics. Perfection, no mistake anywhere. When Max Miller had edited the Rig Veda, those 4 volumes, beautifully printed, came to India. The Indian Pandits wouldn't touch them because they were done by nature. But gradually they saw that their manuscripts were not correct, it was correct. So gradually they started using that. The perfection in the editing of the Rig Veda. For the first time, Sanskrit texts were edited correctly. And this is a very important factor in the whole of Indian tradition, whether Tibetan, whether Mongolian. In Tibetan and Mongolian, they used to do critical, edited versions in xylography. For xylography, they did a very meticulous edition. Same thing in China, same thing in Tibet, same thing in Mongolia. In India, we didn't do xylography, we wrote by hand. The copies would write anything, they would make mistakes, they wouldn't be able to read letters. And sometimes they create problems. For example, in Central Asian history, the main deity of Khotan, Gomasala Gandha monastery. Gandha has no meaning. And nobody has so far been able to identify what is this Gomasala Gandha. They have different opinions. But it's actually Galva, Gomasara Galva. For this we have to work out the history of stones in Sanskrit. Then only we can see what is the meaning. Are they 2 words, are they 3 words, and so on. So the perfection in European edition was a very special feature. And my father went to England because of the perfection of the edition of the Vanaratna Mahodishi. All the editions. So we always used European edition, perfection. Collation of manuscripts, again a European tradition. In Sanskrit, in places we find that they have given the variant readings, but not in a systematic way. For example, when I started studying Sanskrit, my teacher, I had 2 editions of the Shakuntalam, Madhigyana Shakuntalam. One was in Bengali letters, the other was in Devanagari letters. I love the Bengali letters because they are very beautiful, the most beautiful form in the Indian system. So my teacher, my Pandit would say, "You are not reading correctly." I said, "Pandit, it is written there." His edition was different, so I told my father, "Panditji is telling me all the time that I am reading wrong Sanskrit." No, my father said different edition. So I got a Devanagari version to study the Abhidhyana Shakuntalam. That was my first text in Sanskrit. So the whole idea of version, idea of giving variant readings, idea of correction of words was a special feature of European scholarship. Perfection in everything. Discussion of small matters. Discussion of single roots. When I went to Professor Konda, he gave me his books. His thesis was on Deik no me. I see. Deik no me. So I asked Professor Konda a question. Deik, it's like Hindi dekhna, to see. He couldn't answer. That was the Greek form, Deik no me. In Sanskrit we don't have this form. The no infix, me of course is okay, but we don't have the formation from drish, we have it from pashyami. So all these small verbal variations, they are important. For example, a Chinese professor came to me one day and asked, the name of the father of Lord Buddha in Chinese is precious rice, Shuddhodana. Shuddha is pure, Odana is cooked rice. So I told the Japanese person, no, if we analyze the word, it is Shuddha and Udana. Perfect irrigation. A king who gives perfect irrigation to his people. Because India was an agricultural dominant society. So irrigation was a very important function of the state and of the king. So on the perfection, the comparative study within the system, within Sanskrit, without Sanskrit, outside. How do the Tibetans translate? How do the Chinese translate? How do the Thais translate? India's independence. My father was a freedom fighter and would lecture every Tuesday at the temple, as I told you earlier, and lecture on the freedom of India. Because Mahatma Gandhi also used to read the Bhagavad Gita. For him it was an ethical approach, for me, my father, it was a political approach. Because in the Bhagavad Gita there are certain passages which are clearly indicative that, oh Arjuna, you have to get up and fight. Bhagavad Gita is the only scripture in the world declared on the field of battle. So India's independence struggle was very much a part of our house. And the British were very nice to my father. They had appointed a Brahmin inspector of police to take my father. Because my father didn't like a Muslim handling him. Pandit Iqbal Narayan. He came from Peshawar. A real Hindu but looked like a Pathan. A Brahmin. Didn't eat meat. So he would come to my father and take him, but not put the shackle. My father said, we are not criminals. So, he would have to go every year, once or twice. So, we know what freedom was. And if we had a Muslim police, they would take all the money in the house. So we had nothing to eat. No money to buy anything. India became independent in 47. Actually, in 46, India, Pandit Nehru became the Prime Minister. And in 1935, there were already Congress governments in different states. So actually, the freedom of India begins in 1935. And my father knew practically all the chief ministers. Many of them came to Lahore and would stay with me, in our house. So he knew most of the ministers, chief ministers, and also ministers. So it was not something which was extraneous, They would discuss many things. Then the cabinet mission came. Mahatma Gandhi asked my father to come to Shimla because he wanted to discuss with him something. And the press was very keen to know what my father had discussed with Mahatma Gandhi. But that was not to be divulged. So, and my father used to go to see Mahatma Gandhi many times. Mahatma Gandhi was interested in the language problem of India. What was the language of the free India? Part of our freedom struggle. In the beginning he was in favor of Hindi, later on he shifted to Hindustani. So my father used to go to him to discuss these things. I think he must have seen him 7 or 8 times in Burma. So India's independence was a great inspiration. We had poet Tagore on the one side, Aurobindo in the spiritual field, Annie Besant, who has written some of the most beautiful explanations of Hinduism. Actually, they should be reprinted as a corpus. The whole idea of cultural nationalism came from Annie Besant. The Irish freedom struggle. She was Irish by nationality. So the whole idea of cultural nationalism, where language plays an important part. And even in the Indian constitution, my father insisted that we should write in the constitution, like the Irish constitution, that we, the people of India, give to ourselves this constitution on such and such a day. The British Parliament passed an act of India's independence, but we said no. We, the people of India, give to ourselves this political freedom. Difference of attitude. So many things, the subsequent period, my father, the constitution, drafting the constitution started in 46 or 47. Rajendra Prasad, who later on became the President of India, he wanted a word for constitution. So telephoned my father in Nagpur. Please come, I want to discuss with you. My father went there and said, constitution, you explain to him how to make words, how there is a semantic family of words. So he said, constitution is Samvidhan, legislation is Vidhan, legislative assembly is Vidhan Sabha, and so on. So Rajendra Babu was fascinated by the word Samvidhan. So the word Samvidhan for constitution, on which generations of Indians will take oath of office, is my father's contribution. So he was translating the draft constitution and finally the adopted constitution by the Constituent Assembly. And when he was all then Rajendra Babu, the president of the Constituent Assembly, said that you should come to Parliament. Telephoned Pandit Nehru that we should have him in the Parliament. Nehru said, he is not in the Parliament. Okay. So he telephoned the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh that such and such a person doesn't come, get his resignation and bring my father in. So my father was a member of the assembly. And when the final signatures came, the problem was, will the Hindi version be the official version when Hindi became the official language of India? My father said yes. So he shouted to Rajendra Babu, sign in the Hindi constitution, Hindi Samvidhan mein anubad kar. So all the members have signed the Hindi constitution. So my father's role was, very seminal in certain aspects of the formation of the constitution, the language laws. He was always in discussion with K.M. Munshi, because K.M. Munshi was a member of the drafting committee of the constitution. And my father was particularly interested in the language clause. So I spoke to Munshi. So India's independence was very much a part of our life, just as linguistics was. My father used to teach Indo-European linguistics at the University of Lahore, Punjab. He was a professor of Sanskrit, but for the master's degree, there was no one to teach Indo-European linguistics. So he was teaching Indo-European linguistics, politics, linguistics, translating the Mahabharata, comparing it with the Indonesian Kavi version. He was teaching Japanese. He was for the first time in history, he started classes of Japanese. He had about 16 students who were studying Japanese with him in 1935. In 1936, 2 Japanese students came, so they were taking the Japanese classes. But he is the founder of teaching of Japanese language in India. So many things were being done by him, and I inherit his tradition. At what institutions were you engaged? I was never engaged in any institution. I worked with my father. Many things had to be done. We were trying to formulate a language for the technical sciences, natural sciences. It was a huge task. So I was helping my father in that. So I was working only at the International Academy of Indian Culture. Botany. As a child, my father used to read the Upanishads. He was very fond of the Upanishads, particularly the Ishopanishad and Katha Upanishad. So one day he said that there is a rishi, a student comes to him and asks him the question, how do you define this universe? He said, grow a seed of the banyan tree and watch it. So he watched the banyan tree, the leaves coming out and so on. So that fascinated me. I also grew a banyan tree in a small pot. In about, I think, 1 or 2 months, the pot had to be put into the ground. So every day I would watch what has happened. And it was strange, In the night, 2 big leaves came out one day. From where did they come? What is inherent in the minutest of minutest? Anoraniyam Mahato Bhariyam. That Anoraniyam fascinated me. So I would watch that. And I did that for about 4 or 5 years. It grew up into a tree. When we left our residence in the partition, it had become a mighty tree. From a tiny seed, mighty tree. Botany fascinated me. So I studied botany, and I still have my notebook of some of the drawings that I did of the botanical teachers. And later on, I edited 30 volumes of the Advancing Practice of Botany. When it came to the parliament, so I had to stop the journal, because the parliament also took a lot of time, and I was a rather active member. The beauty of the Japanese scroll of the Amitabha, the beauty of the Japanese primers, quite extraordinary and quite unique. They represented the beauty of the evanescence of Shunyata. You see something very light, something very Shunya. What is now exercising the mind of quantum physicists? What is Shunya? To understand that Shunya, you have to accept the duality of the principle of life and the universe. So Japan, I became very much interested in Japanese language readers. The other thing, my father said that the state of Japan was created by Shotoku Taishi. And he, when he created this state, made the constitution, he consecrated it with the Japanese Sanskrit manuscripts of the Ushnish Vijaya, a hymn to supreme victory. So that was at that time the second earliest Sanskrit manuscript known in the world. The first was the Gandhari Dhammapada, but this was the second earliest manuscript. So Sanskrit. So then we had the Japanese students. They used to recite Sanskrit mantras. They are beautiful books in Tibetan. Some of them printed in the 16th century. I still have one of them. Printed in the 16th century. Beautiful wood printing. It has a different kind of inking. Half visible, half invisible. Half light, half dark. Special kind of printing pressure. Must have been done with the hand, because they had to be the mantras. So all these things, I went to Japan in 1971, I think. 1970, for the first time. What I saw in Japan was unbelievable. Their monasteries, the grandeur of those monasteries. Went to a temple of Ganesha there. 1,000, it has been going on for 1,000 years. And still people go there to request Ganesha, to make their courtship successful. I couldn't see the statue because it was all corrupted. Went to see the markets in Japan. They had Sanskrit texts printed in the 17th, 15th century, 16th century. Very expensive, exorbitant. So Japan, I collected a large number of Sanskrit texts. In Japan, they have about 1,000 texts in the Kokiji monastery. They deserve to be printed because they have many interesting texts among them. Some of them are interesting for Korean history, some of them are interesting for Chinese history. I am writing on one of those texts for Chinese history. The Dharani to pure radiance. Vimala Prabha. I'm writing on that. So there are many texts which are interesting, not just for religious pursuit, but also for political history. And explaining the life of Empress Wu in the context of this Dharani to Vimala Prabha. So Japan, I brought about 50 or 60 Sanskrit texts from Japan. There are 1,000. They also deserve to be published. Indonesia, has many. It has about 2,000 texts based on Sanskrit works. Some of them are very fascinating. For example, poet Tagore's ancestor was the author of the Veni Sanghara. Veni Sanghara has been used in the Mangala Charana, invocative verse of one of the parvas of the Mahabharata. So interesting that Indonesia had such texts like the Veni Sanghara. They must have had a very rich text. For example, they have the Janaki Harana, which I identified in the Indonesian manuscripts. And they have versions of the Bhartrihari's Shatakas, which were more ancient than the present version. And there are hundreds of these texts called Krita Bhasha texts. Sanskrit has been shortened to a disyllabic root because Indonesian means 2 syllables. So Krita Bhasha texts. So all these interests somehow they come together, they harmonize. They harmonize in explaining the different currents that have flowed in ancient history. To view the past either in the West or in the East as isolation is not correct. We were sharing. Trade was a very important part of the process of human sharing. James Smith. James Smith came to India in 1957. His coming was a great event in the publication of Tibetan texts. Just before his arrival, the head of the American Library, Library of Congress, they wanted the collected works, the Sumbum of Bhutan. I said, we can print it. So the printing of the Sumbum of Bhutan was taken up, 28 volumes. Then I requested the Princey, who was heading the Library of Congress, that why not publish important Tibetan texts under the PL 480 program. The idea was accepted. Gene Smith came. Gene Smith became extremely busy with the publication of these texts. He would sort these texts out, come to me every week to discuss the publication of these texts. Should we publish the Sumbums? I said, yes, they are as important as any other text. Publish all the historical texts. So the Gene Smith became a great friend, and particularly because he was the only one who understood the value of preserving the Tibetan heritage. And ultimately he did the digitalization of practical all the holdings of the world. So during his last visit he came to see me. We discussed the translation of the Tibetan Kangyur and Pangyur into English. It was being done in the United States. The question was how to translate the Sanskrit words. We discussed a number of words. I have no report of what we discussed, but I remember one word, Kalyana Mitra. Friend, spiritual friend. I said no. The Guru cannot be a friend in the Indian system. I said we have the word Mitra in the Iranian sense, not in the Sanskrit sense. In Iran, Varaha Mihira, Mitra become Mihira in Iranian, means blessed by the god, sun god. Mitra means the sun. Mitra here means blessed by Mihir. Agni Mitra, but doesn't mean friend of fire, means blessed by the god Agni. The argument, when fascinated him, the Agni Mitra argument, Varaha Mihira. I thought we have so many names with Mitra. Why? A translator, Mitra Sena in time. People have translated him Shanta Mitra. They don't understand, makes no sense. Mitra Sena. He is a Mitra. He is one blessed. And Sena is the suffix for a Kshatriya name. So Mitra Sena has a meaning. My restoration of his name. Otherwise, people write Mitra Shankar. With a question mark, of course. I put no question mark, I am positive. So we said, Kalyana Mitra is the teacher who gives you the religion, the system, the philosophy, who gives you the Kalyana. Kalyana is the same word as the Greek kalos, beautiful, who gives you the beauty of the mind, the sanctity of the mind. So now, how to translate, I don't recollect, but Gene Smith must have written that. What I suggested for the translation of Kalyana Mitra. That was our last talk, And then I wrote on him the Gene Smith in his Dharmakaya. So somewhere he lives in his Dharmakaya. That Dharmakaya is the vast digitalization of Tibetan texts. There he lives. They asked me many other questions. Padma Bhushan Prize by the government in 2006. It came to me as a surprise. I never went for it. I don't know who suggested my name. But I have many decorations from different countries. I have no list. Russia. In the Soviet Union, my father was the first to request the Soviet ambassador to make a presentation of the Bibliotheca Buddhica to him, 50 volumes. He said, we have nothing like this in the Soviet Union. My father insisted. He was a member of parliament and of the ruling party. The Soviets could not afford to refuse a member of parliament of the ruling party. They needed India's support on the international level. We supported them on every issue, politically. So, finally, after 2 years, the Bibliotheca Buddhica came to my father. My father invited the Vice President Radhakrishnan to chair the presentation ceremony. Radhakrishnan came, made a beautiful speech. But the speech of the Soviet ambassador was really remarkable. He spoke of Buddhist studies in Russia before the revolution. For the first time, the Russians had heard Radhakrishnan as he was India's ambassador to the Soviet Union in Leningrad. The corridors were full. People had come to hear him. That was the first, my father was the second Bibliotheca Buddhica. In the Buddhist Patriarch of the Soviet Union, they have not sent their tribute to my father. My father passed away in 1963. They have not sent his tribute, their tribute. The Buddhist Patriarch had met him in 1956 when they had come for the Buddha Jayanti celebrations. Had a long talk, asked about the monasteries. Dead silence in the Buddhist Patriarch, because they all had been destroyed to the ground level. About the Sanskrit manuscripts in those monasteries, nothing, no speech. So in 1967, the Buddhist Patriarch of the Soviet Union came to India, that came to meet me, to pay condolences for my father. He said, why don't you come to the Soviet Union? I said, yes, I can come, but on one condition, that my father couldn't visit Buryatia. I said, if the Soviet Union takes me to Buryatia, I will come. It was decided they took us to Buryatia. Kailash, my friend, 3 of us men, myself, my wife, and Dr. Kailash Chandra. We were there, saw many things. Everything ruined. No books, nothing. Saw some books in the Institute of the Academy of Sciences. Went to the Aginsky monastery, which I had heard so often from my father. Buddhist logic of Shtcherbatsky mentioned the Aginsky monastery in a number of places. So went to see the Aginsky monastery. Went there to a room. A paper was lying on the floor. I picked up the paper. I knew some Lama must have been flying, running away. The paper fell down there. It had some Sanskrit words, then Tibetan. The Buddhist patriarch said, no, you can't lift it. It lay there. The Buddhist patriarch would sit with me in the evenings, tell me what has happened, write in Tibetan on a piece of paper. No interpreter, no one. He was weeping all the time. He said, someday my prayer will come. I said, yes. Before 2000, my prayer will come. Came in 1990. I, for the first time, wanted to see a Maitreya festival. The Soviets had to permit the Buddhists to arrange a Maitreya festival for me. So I was responsible for the opening up of the Buddhist Sangha in the Soviet Union, step by step, in small minor events. Wherever we went, the Buddhists came to pay homage to us. Wherever my wife did the salutation lying down on the floor, the Buddhists would also do it there because an Indian had done it. It was a holy place. So the Soviet opening up of the Soviet Union was to Buddhism in the Soviet Union was very much a part of my life. I went to the Soviet Union 7 times as a member of parliament. One day the Prime Minister asked me, why do you go here so often? People say that you are a communist. I said, no ma'am. I just go there to see that Lord Buddha lives in the Soviet Union. He smiled. So my visit to Russia, and then I saw their big collections, week of collection and so on. So many sumbums. They had opened up those sumbum parties, separated the text. I said, no, put them back. Ask someone to come from India to put them back. So, in the Soviet Union, I had a very special meeting with Sakharov. Sakharov was the father of the atom bomb in Russia. Was a dissident at heart. But the Soviet government couldn't touch him because he was the supermost nuclear physicist in the Soviet Union. He wanted me to, we had discussed with the Buddhist part several times what is the difference between Buddhism and other religions. They couldn't answer. So we had a long conversation with Sakharov, I think an hour and a half, in Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk was not, foreigners were not allowed to go to Novosibirsk. I had special permission to go to Novosibirsk to see the Buddhist remains there, beautiful remains of how the Buddhists used to live in Novosibirsk as compared to the Russian homes were poor. The Buddhist homes were amply rich. There was the prayer room, tankas, statues, floors had carpets, beautiful carpets with beautiful designs. Russian prisoners who were sent exiled, the Russian exile, they had nothing. So I saw all that. Then met Sakharov. When Sakharov said, what's the difference? I said, first thing is Buddha doesn't believe in a theocentric world. He believes in a homocentric world. Explained to him a lot of things. Also explained to him another thing, that in Buddhism, the Eightfold Noble Path has nothing about God. nothing about religion. It says how to do away with the problems of life, what he calls dukkha or sorrow. And it's not sorrow actually. So you read the Eightfold Noble Path once again as part of the quality of life. So Buddhism is quality of life. The other thing, you have to remember that among the four Judaic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam and communism, the fourth. Sakharov was taken aback. He said, communism? Yes. I said, it's a religion. It's an ideology. Buddhism believes in ideas. The Judaic systems believe in ideologies. But somehow, the Jews, they were traders. Among the traders, the other is as important as me. The whole question of alterity in Judaism is not accepted in any other tradition of Judaism. Either in Christianity, all the pagans were destroyed, killed. The oak tree outside the Kremlin is actually for killing the pagans. They would put the head of the pagans on that oak tree and thus kill it with a sword. So actually the Jews didn't do it because they wanted the customer. So told him, only in trade, in big trade you need the other. He said, it's very interesting observation. I said something quite opposite to what Karl Marx has said. And so on. So we discussed a number of problems. And Sakharov was very happy to meet me. Perhaps he has left some notes somewhere in his papers. I'm not sure. Because he and one more poet, they were two dissidents in the Soviet Union who used to write and do samizdat, self-publication, and circulate it among friends. So gradually in the Soviet Union, an anti-communist trend was fast evolving among the intellectuals. I was also a contributor to that. Tibetan Diaspora. Well, Tibetans came to us in the form of Gendun Choepel and others. We had 3 Tibetan Lamas, then came the Sunday, the Buryat Lama Sanpo, then Lama Chimpa. 3 Lamas were residing in our house. So when the Tibetans started coming to India, my father was very much interested in them. And he, for the first time, tried to print public books for their school children. He told His Holiness that you must keep the Tibetan language alive. Create your own schools. And Kundeling, one of the very important persons who created the Tibetan system of education in India, Tibetan schools. He used to come, we published for Tibetan textbooks for the first time. My wife used to go there to the children to give them gifts to the New Year and so on, the Tibetan New Year and so on. So the Tibetan diaspora, for us was a very part of our language, of life. And then came Mrs. Frida Devi. She was working among the Tibetans. She would bring Tibetan artists from the road. She brought one Tibetan artist to work with me for I think about 7 or 8 years. He had nothing to eat, so we gave him a room, we gave him work, we gave him a salary. We had about 4 Tibetan artists work. One of them was one very brilliant, and he later on went to Switzerland and used to make very beautiful kankas. Well, Hugh Richardson, Snellgrove. Hugh Richardson used to came to my father after he returned from Tibet. The Tibetans objected to a Britisher being the political officer of India and Tibet. So Apa Pant went there and replaced Hugh Richardson. So Apa Pant also met my father before going to Tibet and was very close to His Holiness. Helped His Holiness to escape also, which nobody will tell you. So Hugh Richardson, immediately after coming from Nasa to India, he met my father, came very frequently to him. They had long discussion about the future of Tibet. There is no record. Snellgrove and I have worked together on the Sarvata Sagar Sattva Sangraha, the Vajradhatu Mandala. Lot of problems because when the 5 Buddhas, Panchatathagata, they have been taken to be the norm. Actually, they are part only of the Vajradhatu system. So David Snellgrove and I did the addition. I copied it from Nepal, from the Kesar Samsher collection. Then Snellgrove copied it, then one more person copied it. I forgot. He was teaching Sanskrit in Cambridge. So 3 of us, finally no copy was complete. Some pages were not good in this, some. So I said, give them to me and they put the best photographic enlargements, and we did a photographic edition of the Sarvata Sagar. And Snellgrove otherwise also used to come to me quite often. For example, I got him permission to work in Ladakh. It was not Ladakh was not open to foreigners at that time. So I think he was one of the few foreigners who were permitted to go there. Likewise, Geza Besant Palvi also I requested the defense minister himself to give him permission to visit Ladakh. Johannes Nobel, Conde, Baku, Jacques Baku. I like the grammar of Jacques Baku. And besides the grammar of Yashke, I studied the grammar of Jacques Baku. Very clear. Ferdinand Lessing. You know, Ferdinand Lessing and I were to do an edition of the 4-language Mahavipati. He sent me a few samples, but could not find the funding for completing the work. So I had contact Jong. I knew Jong very well. He wrote an article against me in the Indian Journal. He was quite, what I would say, indecent in many ways, writing against practically all his colleagues. So one day I went to Leiden, I was there in Leiden, I went to see him. He said, I have many things to discuss with you. We started the discussion, it went on till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He came to see me at the railway station. At the railway station, he said, I want to ask you a question. You have not said anything against me. I said, that is not my way of dealing with fellow academicians. We all are a very small community. We should respect each other and we should promote each other, because otherwise our learning will go down. For the sake of Tibetan studies, I don't say anything against any scholar. I can differ from anyone, but not against anyone. Not against. De Jong smiled. And when I went to Australia for the international conference, I was seated on the dais. The representative of the government of India, Dr. Kapila Vatsal, she said, how are you on the dais? I said, Kabiraji, long story. I represent perhaps more India than you. You represent the government. I represent India's learning. I represent the rishis. You represent the rajas. So who are greater? The rajas die, the rishis. Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies in India. We have Buddhist studies in several universities in India now. Nalanda University is coming up in a big way. The buildings are being constructed, and I hope in the next 1 or 2 years we will have a good faculty. Tibetan studies are, I think, are best done in the monasteries of Tibetan monasteries in India and in the Sarnath Central Tibetan University, where they do real publication work. So Tibetan studies, I think, are on a better level than Buddhist studies. We have actually really no Buddhist scholars of eminence. Buddhism demands a number of languages, and Buddhist most of there are no jobs if you do Buddhist studies. So let us think that they will continue somehow, somewhere, but not on a big scale. What we need is qualitative upliftment, upgrading of Buddhist studies in India. Buddhist studies which are being carried on in the university do only the preliminary level. For example, to educate the Sanskrit text, I did the Nishpanna Yogavali. The Nishpanna Yogavali edition of Bhattacharya is wrong in many places when you compare it with the Tibetan. I used a 12th century manuscript to correct the Sanskrit text, which is close to Tibetan. And the readings are correct, they make sense. In spite of all that, the very first stanza of the Nishpanna Yogavali doesn't make sense, in spite of the Tibetan translation. So, Buddhist manuscripts, manuscripts of Sanskrit Buddhist texts are very few and rare. So Buddhist studies have to pick up. I think we need some help from the West in terms of scholarship. Tibetan studies are all right, especially in Sarna. Interpretative Buddhist studies in general. Changes in you see, these changes in approach will depend on the person writing. We have certain people who interpret Buddhism in sociological terms, people who interpret it in political terms. But what we understand by Buddhist studies are really serious studies from the historical point of view and also from the point of view of future. What is the future of Buddhism, for example, in Japan? In China it is strong. In India Buddhism is picking up, but no scholarship. They are just monks. They question if they have no Buddhist ritual. So the monks also are not connected with society as a whole. The weakness of Buddhism throughout history has been that it had no ritual. A Japanese goes for marriage to a church. For a child just born, he goes to a Shinto shrine. So the life rituals are absent in Buddhism, they have to be created. So interpretation will depend on the sect you belong to. If you belong to the Amitabha sect, interpretation is different. If you belong to the Lotus Sutra, the interpretation is different. In the Lotus Sutra is centered in Magadha. Amitabha Sutra is centered somewhere in the northwest. We cannot define the precise place, but it is one of the earliest texts we have gone to China, from the northwest. So there is the Uttara Pathaka Buddhism, there is the Madhya Desha Buddhism. Madhya Desha is not central India, Madhya Desha is Magadha. So someday some people may get interested. But actually Buddhist studies will remain on the teaching level. I won't say they will attain any research level as we see at the present, except what is being done in Sarnath. They are publishing new texts, both in Sanskrit, in Tibetan. They are publishing new commentaries on Tibetan, on Buddhist texts, both in Tibetan and in Hindi and English. And of course there is a major program for the translation of the Kangyur and Panjur into English. So let us see what will happen there. The other thing I would like to say is that all the research work we have done is I have put that into a volume under the title The Charisma of Tibet. And I am very thankful to you for my presentation, and I hope that someday we will have the pleasure of seeing you in India, number one. Number two, also discussing many things about Tibet. For example, the whole life of Padma Bhushan. Why did he fly away from Tibet? The Tibetans date their currency to 233 AD. Tibetans have accepted themselves as a state for the last 1800 years. So there is no reason for Tibet being recognized as a state once again. And Tibetan disrecognition of Tibet as a state under Dhatu Thori goes back to the time of Samudragupta. In Itsing, the Chinese pilgrim to India, has mentioned that his grandfather had created a monastery for Chinese monks and called it China Vihara. Itsing has not translated this word but transcribed this word China Vihara. So the Gupta emperors were conscious of their contacts with the great world powers. For example, China. They had trade with China, that is why he created a monastery for Chinese monks. He must have Samudragupta sent one of his pandits to Tibet. Nelpa Pandita Chojung mentions this fact that he sent the Karanda Vibhu to Tibet. And we used to get gold from Tibet. That is clear from the Meghaduta of Kalidasa. So there are many problems like this, which are not only interesting, but which are fundamental for understanding the evolution of Tibet and its assertion of its independent identity. The Chinese princess. We were sitting with R.A. Stein in a cafe in Paris long ago, 1950s. Stein said that the image of Wen Cheng, the Chinese princess of Sonsen Gampo, is very European in its features. So we had a discussion, just to shorten, I told Professor Stein that the Chinese emperor would not give a full-blooded imperial princess to a barbarian king of Tibet. So he gave a imperial princess from a concubine who must have been a Roman person, Roman queen, well, we can call her queen. So she was sent, and she must have been so beautiful that Sonsen Gampo accepted her without any hint. Many questions. So the whole of Tibetan history has to be viewed as a dynamism of political power, not only as Buddhism. And our role in Tibet. Why does Kalidasa say that Mansarovar, Kailasha or Mansarovar is the town of the god of wealth? Alakapuri, the god of wealth. Because gold used to come from Tibet to India. And we send them cotton fabrics and so on, many things, to Tibet. So what went during the time of Lathopuri, the current, the viewer, was translated during the Samsung Gampo's time, then became the symbol of Tibetan Buddhism. So a lot of work which was done in the last 2 centuries on Tibet needs a new look, because Tibet is fighting for her existence, for her life. They are engaged in a life struggle. We have to help them, that we have been in state for 1800 years. And Tibetans have a gyallo, a royal date, which is about 2050. That has also to be seen from whom do they give that date. So Tibet has a state. To make a personal observation, the American asked Pandit Nehru whether Tibet should be sent to the United Nations. My father insisted Tibet should be. Chakappa came to India. But Nehru didn't want to support Tibet. My father asked why. He said they are a theocracy. How can we support a theocracy? My father said they will become a democracy. We'll persuade them. Send them to the United Nations. The chance was missed. Tibet lies in tears.